Thank you very much, Professor Golding. One of the files that I'm working on right at the moment is travel abroad, encouraging students to go on York U Abroad courses. And I think I've been taking notes. I think I have a phenomenological argument to promote York U Abroad courses. So thank you to Professor Golding. None of us have not noticed that our guest of honor has arrived, so I just want to acknowledge John O'Neill. Thank you for being with us. Wonderful. It's lovely that you're here, and I'm sure that everyone's delighted that you'll be able to spend time during lunch to meet with people. So welcome, warm welcome to you. Our second speaker in this morning's session is Professor Mark Featherstone. Mark Featherstone's a senior lecturer in sociology at Keele University in the UK, so he's done some traveling. His research interests revolve around the study of critical theory and psychoanalysis, and his primary focus is the social and political history of utopian thought. He has published a range of articles on this topic and also a monograph on the history of utopias in Western thought entitled De Tocqueville's Virus, published in 2008. He is currently working on a second volume of this work, which will be entitled Planet Utopia, which should be published in 2014, so next year. His paper today, his presentation today, is entitled Einstein's Nightmare, Plato's Cave and Beyond. Professor Featherstone.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a real honour to be asked to come and present today. It's the first thing I'd like to say. Secondly, as most British academics do when they present, they like to get their excuses in first. So I'd say I'm jet-lagged, part of my head is elsewhere, and so please bear with me. But in a way, that's probably a good way to present this paper, because what I want to talk about is John's work on the media. And I want to look at ways we can kind of extend his work from Plato's Cave and understand kind of contemporary media through some of his ideas. And centrally, what I want to look at is the idea of it as my own experience today, a kind of subject or an individual kind of being split, where the part of the individual is here, but in a way their head is elsewhere. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about an internet meme called Einstein's Nightmare, and I'm going to try to understand it as Plato's Cave, really, in extremis. And so I'm going to use an internet meme to extend and expand John's idea of what he calls capital cave culture, where kind of consciousness is warped by capital ideology. And the form of media I'm going to take is mobile, kind of digital media, centrally smartphones, iPads, all of these kind of gadgets. And I'm going to argue that what these gadgets do is they complete the work of de-familisation and individualisation, which John discusses in Plato's Cave, and so create a kind of lonely individualism, a lonely individual locked into capitalism by the gadget. And so in the longer version of this paper, which I've developed and using the work of the French writer Bernard Stiegler, I focus on a lot more on this idea of a gadget, so I'm not going to develop those ideas too much in this paper. But what I am going to do, I'm going to contrast what I think is this kind of model of media asociability with a model of sociality rooted in generosity and gifting, and we've heard quite a lot about the gift this morning. And I'm going to relate that to my idea of, or my experience really as John as a teacher. And then I'm going to link this up to the idea of the object, which I take from psychoanalysis and object relations theory, writers like D.W. Winnicott. And I'm going to contrast two kinds of objects, a profane commodity kind of object, which I take to be the kind of media gadget, and then I'm going to contrast that with a sacred object, which I'm going to understand, which I'm going to kind of relate to John's work, the object, the book as an object. And I'm going to argue there's a kind of utopian dimension to the book as an object, which is my experience of John's teaching and John's work. And using Winnicott, I'm going to argue that these objects can open up a kind of whole world for the student, which is, again, my experience. Okay, so consider O'Neill's concept of communicative privacy. The recent internet meme, Einstein's Worst Nightmare, explains that the day Albert Einstein feared has arrived. And so the meme, this is basically the meme, and it appeared all over the internet late 2012, early 2013. So the nightmare is the The day Albert Einstein theories finally arrived. Below the caption, 6 images show people in various collective scenarios, having coffee with friends, a day at the beach, cheering for your team, on an intimate day, enjoying the sights, having dinner. And what they show is, as you can see, a communal or social event kind of torn by technological mediation. In each image, people are distracted. They grasp gadgets, gaze at screens, lose themselves in mediation. They're immersed, lost in their iPhones, smartphones and other devices, and they ignore their friends and family members, the people around them. Scroll down, the meme quotes Einstein itself. Here we read the details of Einstein's nightmare. And the nightmare is, I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots. Now, perhaps a meme is inspired by McLuhan, Baudrillard, or both. It also reflects our subterranean fate lost in Plato's cave. Here, the technological medium of human communication has started to work against its original purpose, the creation of the social itself. So we gaze at screens, we communicate with absent virtual bodies, but we ignore the real people in our immediate vicinity. So we're anywhere and potentially everywhere, but here, now, which is kind of a bit of the way I feel giving this paper. My head is kind of, part of my head is somewhere else. So in this way, the people in the image are McLuhan's gadget lovers. They love their iPhones because they insulate them from the stress of real social interaction. As McLuhan explains, there's simply too much happening in our hyper-mediated society to take everything in, so we self-amputate ourselves in gadgets. On the other hand, in order to balance our retreat into isolation, we fall into Baudrillard's ecstasy of communication, where we become addicted to the very act of communication itself. So here, meaning is irrelevant. Speak, write, communicate for the sake of it. So as John saw long before the internet became a kind of life support system, and certainly long before the iPhone took off, we rely on media for our sense of identity. And John uses this brilliant phrase, televideo ergo sum. I'm on screen, therefore I am. I exist and resist my self-imposed retreat from the world because I communicate at distance. So according to the meme, this is Einstein's technological dystopia, Plato's cave in extremis. Now in this paper, I'm going to explore John's work on the media, what we might call media culture, more broadly the ways in which media culture reflects contemporary capitalist society. Now the main work where John explores this terrain is of course Plato's cave. And the title of my paper, Einstein's Nightmare, reflects an attempt to update Plato's cave for the 21st century, where the nature of TV and mass media more generally has been radically altered by digitisation. Perhaps most centrally, what I want to try to do is show that John's discussion and analysis remain kind of relevant to understanding contemporary media culture, and that his exploration of the ways in which media culture obscures the destruction of social life by late capitalism is essential to understanding the trajectory of our hyper-connected societies. Now, one might respond, of course, that this update is not really necessary, that the passage of time between the early 90s when Plato's cave first appeared and the contemporary period is not significant enough to put interpretive strain on the book's work. However, as we know, 2 decades is a long time in our hyper-mediated world. In our postmodern era, characterised by what the French thinker Paul Virilio calls drumocracy, where only the fastest survive and slow die because they're unable to move quickly enough. So in that context, 20 years is an awful long time. So as a result, I think that Plato's cave remains relevant to our mediated world, is testament to the power of John's analysis. Unlike the media objects I'm going to go on to talk a bit more about in the paper, which is specifically designed to wither away and have no value beyond a very short period of time. So when I arrived earlier in the week, I quickly realised my iPhone was now completely obsolete and it's kind of 6 months old or something. So what I want to argue is, in contrast to those kind of objects, Plato's cave is a durable text that has stood the test of time. And in this respect, it's appropriate for what I'm a kind of psychopolitical utopian function. But let me pause and rewind a bit. I realise I'm kind of leaping ahead in these comments. I'd like to return to the point of my title, Einstein's Nightmare. Now, I use the title Einstein's Nightmare for my paper today because, like almost everything else in my career, the original idea came from John. During a short phone conversation about a year ago, John mentioned a meme, or mentioned this meme entitled Einstein's Nightmare, which reflects these kind of social scenes disrupted by digital media and supported by the quote from Einstein himself. Now, I'm going to come back to the quote itself because it turns out Einstein never said anything like this. But before I take this turn, I want to frame the kind of discussion and the title of the paper a bit more. The origin of the paper's title is important, and I mention this not simply because I want to labour the point about the influence of John's influence on my work. Rather, what I'm trying to say is I want to recognise my debt to him in order to make a point about the nature of social relations in capitalist society. Now, looking back on my career today, I understand John's teaching, supervision and conversation, not only in terms of his kind of enormous generosity, but more generally through ideas of gifting and the maintenance of a kind of intergenerational contract. Now, the point here is, of course, that this gift is never repaid, and it's not meant to be repaid, because the effect of a repayment would entail the destruction of a relationship between the two parties involved here as kind of teacher and student. So in a way, there's no way I could repay John for his teaching, but at the same time, it's not a debt I would kind of want to offload. Instead, I'd prefer to situate myself as an academic in a kind of gift economy, recognise my debt and try to pass John's gift onto the next generation, which is what I try to do with my own students back in the UK. OK, so why take this detour in a paper on the work of the media in contemporary society? Well, essentially what I want to do is contrast this idea of intergenerational debt with the idea of debt which predominates in what John calls capital cave or media culture. So as he points out in Plato's Cave, media culture destroys collective memory, politics and deeply embedded social relations in the name of the promotion of late capitalism. In the cave culture of late capitalism, memory is destroyed in the name of freeing the possessive individual from the limits of common culture. So this much is really evident from the reference which forms the kind of centrepiece of a meme. So it turns out that Einstein never said anything about the idiocy of a technological mass to anybody. And the idea found in the meme is a kind of reflection of a false memory or media amnesia, which is, of course, exactly what Plato worried about in terms of writing and technical memory over 2,000 years ago. Now, in much the same way that memory collapses before the media form, politics becomes unnecessary because there's nothing to say beyond what can be expressed by rational calculation. One is worth simply more or less. There is no political debate, and so the kind of political division you find in somebody like Carl Schmitt between friends and enemies is not really there's no decision there. It's simply a case of a rational calculation on mathematics. And finally, social relations are similarly made irrelevant because they rely on a kind of structure of feeling that's beyond the zeros and ones, more or less calculations of capitalism. Now, in this context, where the self-possessed individual is everything, the nature of a debt relation is different from the idea of indebtedness to others that grounds the social. So instead, the capitalist idea of debt finds its social and political form in an authoritarian mode of domination. And I've been looking at this in the kind of European context and kind of thinking about this debt social relation in terms of austerity across Europe, Greece, Spain, Italy, Ireland and kind of other countries where debt is turned into this kind of bed and to be kind of escaped. So essentially, it's this shift from social to asocial relations and the ways in which this is reflected in capital cave culture that I'm going to kind of go on to explore now. As I'm going to show throughout, the inspiration for all this work is my reading of Plato's Cave, which I first read in 1990 and have returned to regularly over the course of the last 10 years. Now, in John's work, the role of capitalist media culture is to undermine collective memory, politics, and social relations by individualising the viewer who worships before the screen. So, bathed in electric light, the viewer is interpolated into this cave culture, which commands their attention 24/7. So, the viewer is attached to their, in John's work, the TV, which is a kind of cathode ray nipple. They've got no time for the other, their friends, family. Rather, the screen addict is caught in an endless storm of information that characterises contemporary media communication. So like the prisoners of the cave in Plato's Republic, who were transfixed by these flickering images on the cavern's walls, and never see the mechanisms of control working behind their backs. Today's media viewer is caught in this kind of caught under the spell of endless spectacle, but they fail to recognise the work of technology, the technologies of power occurring behind the scenes. Now, what we have here, of course, is an advance on Foucault's theory of a disciplinary society exploring discipline and punish, where we normalise our behaviour because we believe we're under surveillance. Now, in Plato's cave, we confirm our own subordination not because we believe we're under surveillance, but rather because we cannot avert our gaze from the screen. And so I think in Plato's cave, there's that kind of shift is made apparent from being watched to being a watcher. So in other words, the problem is less that we're watched and more that we watch and spend our time sitting slack-jawed before screens. The act of watching, although there's very little action involved in our capture by this cathode ray nipple, is a kind of function of capitalist ideology because it sutures us into a certain form of society characterised by particular forms of highly individualistic, competitive, acquisitive behaviour. Now, let's take an example of this shift from a surveillance to what I think we could call a viewer society, which I think John captures in Plato's cave. So consider the European TV show Big Brother, and I don't know whether that has kind of made it over to Canada. I'll go on to explain what it is. Beyond Orwell's nightmarish society from 1984, where the citizens of one state are controlled through permanent surveillance by the totalitarian leader, namely Big Brother. In Big Brother, the popular TV show, which emerged in the late 90s, and this is a kind of Dutch show that spread right across Europe. In this show, eager contestants give themselves over to around-the-clock surveillance in order to transform themselves into fleshy commodities or living spectacles. So they become celebrity icons who, to paraphrase Boorstin, Daniel Boorstin from the 50s, I think, they're famous because they're famous and on screen. Meanwhile, the rest of the viewer society eagerly watches Big Brother in order to kind of drown in the banality of the spectacle, which confirms that everyday life in the cave is somehow meaningful and dramatic. So in other words, there's something more than a daily grind of capitalist production, which is a kind of Frankfurt School point about the purpose of the commodity. So as John notes in Plato's cave, in media culture, the screen addict is caught somewhere between being and appearance, which suggests a new route to existential security, which is a kind of meaning of this idea, tele video ergo sum. Participation in a media spectacle is necessary to ensure survival. Now, following the same train of thought, we might also consider the popular variants of Big Brother, which kind of even more clearly reflect psychopathology, or more particularly the sadism of this reality TV format. So, for instance, Celebrity Big Brother, which was a kind of extension of this format. This programme involves faded celebrities desperate for screen time, humiliating themselves in the name of their transformation into saleable spectacles. And an even worse, and a further extension of this, a TV programme called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. In this programme, faded icons punish and torture themselves in some jungle somewhere. For the UK version, they take these celebrities off to the Australian outback, and then they're kind of ritually humiliated and things in these kind of games they have to go through. So they do all this in order to kind of make it into the tabloid press. Now, beyond the horror of a transformation of people into things, which Walter Benjamin talks about through the figure of the prostitute in his work on Baudelaire's Paris, what the example of Big Brother and its various offshoots illustrates is the problem of media cave culture, which is that it presents and communicates an ideological position based solely on a relationship between spectacle, screen time and value. And I think we can kind of see the sadism of that process in kind of various TV programmes, which I've kind of worked on these programmes like 24, Dexter, and other kind of TV shows which I talk about in terms of a culture of cruelty, where the individual is kind of, or there's a kind of morality behind the kind of destruction of the individual. So in my view, or rather consider TV programmes such as 24 and Dexter, where torture and murder are rendered legitimate. And you can also find the same kind of ideas in torture porn films, Hostel, Saw, these kind of things. Another example of this is a British film recently called Shame, which is about a New York banker who's also he's a sex addict, and so his only relationship to people is in the form of the people literally become objects to him. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with the meme, Einstein's nightmare? Well, I want to argue that what the meme discloses is fundamentally this asocial situation, which is kind of characterised by the destruction of embedded social relations and the dominance of what I would want to call sociality at a distance, a form of disembodied sociality defined by distance, weightlessness, virtuality, and centrally digital media characterised by binary code. My claim is therefore that the meme can function as a symbol of a kind of wider asocial situation that we currently inhabit by virtue of the ways that it illustrates this idea of sociality of distance and a kind of thinness of relationality that defines the economic contract of a debtor and a creditor. So the idea is this, what especially neoliberalism does is introduces this idea that you have to kind of escape your debts. Now, the reason I specifically refer to this relationship over other kinds of relationship here is because historically, mobile digital media has evolved in line with high-tech capitalism, where we were always on the move, and capital time, where we are always online and always at work. So in this way, I think that the kind of digital media gadgets reflected in the meme have developed in order to enable us to operate in this kind of new late capitalist universe, where by universe I mean civilizational norms, values, rules, regulations, but also kind of spatio-temporal forms of organisation. So in this way, I follow John's view of TV, in much the same way that TV connects the home to the wider social and political reality. I would argue that the smartphone, or the kind of media gadget, functions like a navel to connect the microscopic world of the individual and their work and personal life to this kind of macroscopic universe of late capitalism. And in doing so, it shapes the way we behave in this environment. So as McLuhan noted long ago, the medium is a message. Here, the very nature of a smartphone, individualised, mobile and defined by digital code, determines the conduct of a user who is similarly individualised, constantly on the move and always online, and prone to this kind of capitalist asociality. So what I think we can observe in Einstein's nightmare then is a kind of advance on Plato's cave, but at the same time which confirms the kind of power of John's analysis. If the cave was the creation of TV, which beamed a dream world into the family home and set about the work of defamilisation, the nightmare is what happens after the process of defamilisation, where the lonely individual is sutured or stitched into global capitalist civilisation by the digital media device, which is absolutely mobile and always on. Unlike TV, which was largely bound to the home, the smartphone or tablet is perfectly suitable for the homeless individual who lives everywhere and nowhere and is always and never on. So herein, I think there's a shift from Plato's cave to Einstein's nightmare. Now, the end of the paper, which I'm not going to kind of go into, I'm not going to read the rest of this because I can see I'm running out of time, but the next part of the paper is about how you would go about escaping this nightmare. And the idea here is that this is where I focus on the kind of objective, the object, the gadget as an object, a kind of profane object, which is, constantly like any commodity, constantly kind of replaceable. And I situate that in terms of a discussion of Apple and Steve Jobs, who had this famous idea, at the end of every press conference, one more thing. So the gadget is always kind of evolving, and there's no sense that you can invest in these things. And what I do is then I contrast that with D.W. Winnicott's idea of the object, which is an object which, in object relations theory, a child will use the object to create a kind of to kind of develop a secure space around itself where it can think creatively and kind of essentially kind of have a relationship to the world around it. And so at the end of the paper, which as I said, I'm not going to go through this in detail, what I do is try to think about John's work and the books themselves as those kind of objects. So in a way, what I would say is there's a utopia, this is where I think the utopian element of John's work resides. When I was an undergraduate, John's teaching, his supervision, and his work performed that kind of role for me. I was a disillusioned undergraduate who probably I don't think I would have continued in academia if I hadn't been taught by John. So his thought was and remains utopian for me. It opened up a creative space for me, which enabled me to think independently. And it led me towards my own studies of utopian and dystopian thinking in kind of social and political history. So this is the kind of debt I owe to John, a debt that, I'm aware I could never kind of repay. And so in my own small way, for me personally, that's my kind of, my way out of Plato's cave and my kind of resistance to the kind of Einstein's nightmare. Okay, thank you. Sorry if I've run on.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder, irony of having to use a microphone in a room where we could all hear one another perfectly well. But please, with your questions, do come to the microphone. And if you would stay to answer them, that would be great.
I'm pleased if I don't have to answer any questions.
So, why not assume that the Big Brother and so forth are not their popularity is not the creation of the technology, but they are using the technology to play on the psychopathology of the people who who watch it. And then, if that's so, and you want to have relations that don't create that psychopathology along the lines of object relations theory, well, how do you get there?
Well, how do you get there? I think you need objects that give people that are durable, that at the same time don't then transform the people into worthless objects. Because I think that's kind of what I see in those TV programs. That in a way, I think the technology and the kind of TV I don't believe the psychopathology exists before the technology. I think the technology creates that relationship and kind of degrades the people to the extent that it then kind of perpetuates that situation. Does that answer the question?
Well, where are you going to find these mothers?
Well, that's what I would say that's kind of how I encountered John's work. Then in a way, he created that space for me when I was an undergraduate. So I experienced my experience of the university, my original experience of it as an undergrad in the UK was a kind of profane, a kind of factory, an alienated space that really did nothing for me. And I think, I expect when I arrived at university as an undergraduate, I kind of realised this is getting a bit kind of personal confession, but I expected to find lots and lots of clever people, and it never happened until John arrived, and I thought, hang on a minute, this is somebody who is kind of doing this stuff seriously. Everything else before then, it seemed to me, it's a kind of factory production line.
So on that note, I want to give you an opportunity to say more about what you wanted to say at the end, but couldn't or didn't. And there's just as in object relations theories, there's a good breast and a bad breast, right?
Yeah.
There's good objects and bad objects, right?
Yeah.
And some books are really good books.
Yeah.
Like John's books,
Yeah.
and some objects are good or bad, or we're
Yeah.
ambivalent about them, like iPads,
Yeah.
and so on. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you're working with the idea of the commodity object.
Yeah, well,
the ambivalence of the commodity object as a good and a bad object.
Yeah. So I mean, in academia itself, obviously, academia is to an extent a kind of production line. So of course there are bad books, and there are lots of them. And in a way, what I think they do for us as academics is and the way they work for me is they completely alienate me from what it is we do. But, you know, my experience of John was he kind of socialised me into a culture where you can, you know, where you can hunt out and more objects that do matter, and kind of created that space for me to kind of think for myself.
I mean, you're doing something now with your students now with, I guess this would be part of a class or
Yeah.
things you could talk about.
Yeah.
So could you say something more about that? Because you're actually not just giving them a book, you're asking them to think about their iPhones or their iPads or what have you, right?
Well, part of it is I want them in a way to slow down. So there's a you know, earlier on I spoke about the kind of Paul Virilio stuff. So I do think there's an element in what John kind of forced me to do was slow down, take notice of something, and kind of and kind of have a different pace towards what I was doing. And I think especially in Britain, academia is something which is incredibly fast. Books are written incredibly quickly. People consume them incredibly quickly, and then they move on to the next thing. So I think in a way the kind of durable object is something that has, there's a dimension of it is the temporal aspect of it.
In Plato's cave, in the Republic, there is an outside of the cave.
Yeah.
In John O'Neill's Plato's cave, there is still an outside.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your talk Baudrillard at one point.
Yeah.
When you speak of the nightmare of Einstein,
Yeah.
the implication is, unless I misunderstood, that there is no outside. Therefore, there is no hope.
No, I think there is an outside, and the outside is what you get through the durable object. But it's an outside which is kind of inside, as it were. So it's impossible to step outside of the kind of media culture, but you can orientate yourself towards it in a more kind of critical way. But then that's why you need kind of that's why you need teachers like the way I experienced John, who was a teacher who gave me a completely different perspective on things, and who socialised me into a way of examining things which you know I'd never experienced before. I'd never come across anybody else who did that kind of thing. And I still think John, you know, 15 years later, John in a way is for me kind of unique in that you don't come across many academics, I think, who can kind of give you that. Okay.
So I think, thank you all. I think we've arrived at lunch. I just want to comment personally. I think it's very moving. My role as Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning, the tribute that Mark has just paid to Professor O'Neill, it's actually quite marvelous to think that when you teach, you have that opportunity to create that kind of opening for students. It's really quite an inspiring thought. So, and that I guess we'll hear more on that in this afternoon's presentation. So great, thank you, and enjoy your lunch.